Good morning to everyone in the US and good afternoon to those connected from Turkey, Europe, and the region. Dear guests, welcome to the Atlantic Council event to discuss outcomes of Turkish elections, which took place on May 14. As Senior Director of Turkey Programs at the Atlantic Council, it is my pleasure to host this timely discussion to break down and analyze the Turkish elections. Last Sunday, Turkey went to polls to vote in presidential and parliamentary elections. With an astonishing 88% turnout, the Turkish people again demonstrated their commitment to democratic process in elections. In the parliamentary vote, President Erdogan's People's Alliance, which is called Cumhur Alliance in Turkish, scored a victory, maintaining control of Turkey's legislative body, although with a reduced majority. While in the presidential vote, Erdogan took a lead with 49.5% versus the main opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, backed by Nation in Turkish Millet Alliance with almost 45%. With neither candidate surpassing 50%, Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu will now go to a runoff on May 28. This is a brief overview, but there is so much to unpack here. So I look forward to hearing our distinguished speakers' thoughts on what the results tell us about the Turkish electorate, political climate implications for the future of Turkish foreign policy. But before that, just so you will also see some housekeeping notes in the chat box. Please follow them. And also after our discussion, we will open the questions to the floor. And you can also use the Q&A box to, pose your questions. But please identify yourself and also the institution you belong to. Unanimous, questions will not be addressed. So please pay attention to that. So without further delay, I am very pleased to be hosting this excellent panel and briefly introduce our distinguished panelists before jumping to our discussion. Aslı Aydın Taşbaş is a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution's Turkey Project, also a well-known Turkish journalist. Dr. Soner Çağatay is the Bayer Family Fellow and Director of the Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, also the author of several Recep Tayyip Erdogan books himself. And Ambassador Alper Coşkun is a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Europe Program, also a former Turkish ambassador. Thank you all for joining us today. It is a pleasure to be hosting you. So I will be now kicking off the discussion with first round of questions, and so we can start. So welcome again. If okay, just maybe we can start. What does the May 14 vote tell us about the Turkish electorate, and how your brief comments on the results? How was Erdogan able to retain so much support in the face of economic headwinds, the earthquake, and more? What explains the resilience of Erdogan popularity in Turkey? So, can we start with Aslı, maybe? Thank you.
Thank you, Daphne. Well, the elections did not turn out the way many pollsters in this country, and certainly much of the international media, and I would say at least half the population thought. President Erdogan held on to power. He did much better than his rival, Kılıçdaroğlu, as you pointed out. It's been a vicious, very vicious campaign here. The president accused his rival of being backed by terrorists in the United States, and his rival, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, said there was Russian interference. But, a few things about the results. First is President Erdogan clearly has a staying power, especially when he's faced with a weak rival. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was a uniter for an opposition coalition of 6 parties, and that he did quite well. But as we all know, he's not been the person that polled highest. He's not been the most formidable rival to possibly run against Erdogan. In fact, he was sort of the riskiest name, and the opposition coalition decided to put forth their riskiest name because they felt that this was the way to keep together 6 different parties, and it turned out to be a difficult gambit. We can't overlook the fact that, yes, there was an uneven playing field and government monopoly over information, communications, televisions, and so on. But the opposition had its own channels. Problem is that Erdogan ran a negative campaign quite vigorously, and the opposition's positive campaign and the fact that they were a divided coalition raised some doubts. There was an expectation of a blue wave in Turkey in favor of the opposition candidate. Instead, there was a conservative and nationalist red wave in favor of Erdogan. I think that, this was Turkey's chance. I wouldn't say last chance, because Turkish society is extremely dynamic, vibrant, and I long term, I do have faith in social dynamics. But I think short term, this was an opportunity to return to rule of law, something that was obviously the primary focus of the opposition campaign, and a predictable management of the economy, a more orthodox understanding, rules-based understanding of the economy, away from what the opposition said was a sort of a one-man regime. And I think that chance is gone. President Erdogan has clearly consolidated his base, but also it's clearly the case that his position, his platform, the fact that he's offering a rising Turkey, a Turkey that makes its own drones and aircraft carrier and all these sort of toys, which were a big part of his campaign, clearly that resonated with some people. I want to, there's so many aspects of this election, from geopolitics to the economy, but I don't want to, touch upon every point, but perhaps end here with this sentence that there have been way too many allegations of irregularities, but at this point, while the opposition has pointed these out, they haven't yet substantiated it. So we have to mention that there are these allegations, but without necessarily knowing for a fact, what it amounts to or how serious these were, because for lack of any tangible evidence.
Aslı, I think this is a great start to begin with, just so I have follow-up questions for you, but I really want to make a first round, just with my other two friends, just so Alper, maybe can you touch base with your first, views on the, election results, since we all know now that there will be a runoff, and also, we know the parliamentary, distribution. And so what is your take? What went wrong for opposition? What went right for the, current alliance, led by AK Party? And so what the results tell you about the, sentiment and feeling of the Turkish electorate?
Well, thank you, Defne, and greetings to everyone. To sum it up, I think both Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu have done it again. Erdogan has succeeded and Kılıçdaroğlu has failed. As the saying goes, it's not over till it's over. There's an upcoming presidential runoff. And in the executive presidential system that Erdogan himself transitioned Turkey to, that office is what really matters. So the opposition still has that opportunity. But of course, Erdogan has the opposition exactly where he would like it to be. And I think the result is exactly where the opposition did not want to be. By their own measure of success, by the opposition's own measure of success, they would have hoped not to cede the majority in parliament to Erdogan and his alliance, which they have. Again, by their own measure of success, they would have expected, if not to have clinched the presidential vote in the office in the first round, which they were increasingly believing they might have the chances of doing, they would have at least wished to have been the leading contender as a result of the vote on the 14th of May. And that did not happen as well. So it's quite clearly a success for Erdogan and a failure on the part of the opposition. The postmortem has a lot of elements that need to be talked about, but I think the main thrust of why we are where we are right now has to do with the fact that the narratives that have been deployed by Erdogan and by Kılıçdaroğlu, which were diametrically opposed to each other, have appealed in varying degrees for the public at large, to the public at large. And in that sense, Erdogan has once again been successful. Some of the elements that he deployed, depicting the opposition as working in tandem with terrorist organizations, subtly reminding the Turkish society that Kılıçdaroğlu is of Alevi identity. This scaremongering about Turkey being up against a tremendous threat of an unnamed and intangible external force, and suggesting that he is the only leader to ensure that Turkey is safe and sound, I think has taken considerations across the board in Turkish society, particularly in the AKP heartlands, where they have forgotten about other daily challenges such as the cost of living, such as the implications of a devastating earthquake, and the ineptitude of the government that was on full display during the relief efforts. Those which, to many of us looking at Turkey, would believe presented a perfect storm for Erdogan, in which one would expect that he would have a really challenging situation in this election. Erdogan has been able to take society's thinking above that, have them focus on a depicted challenge in which he himself was the only leader in that scenario to lead Turkey. And I think the humility that Kılıçdaroğlu tried to relay in his messaging, which was very refreshing actually, was obviously, in the face of this type of depiction, not enough to garner support, and especially when you see the results in parliament and in the way in which people voted in Turkey, the fact that Sinan Ogan was able to gather so many votes, it's clear that Turkish society is more inclined towards nationalist sentiments, towards conservative values. It's not necessarily that I believe Turkish society has been transformed to such an extent that everyone is more nationalistic, but I think the rhetorical environment that Turkey has found itself in the past, particularly decade under Erdogan rule, has made that a leading sort of flavor in Turkish politics. And we see today, Kılıçdaroğlu in the runoff is already transitioning to that type of rhetoric. And we can talk more about that if you want in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Alper. Soner, just so let's continue from there, and your early, just reaction to the, even though we all read what you have already written, but, on the top of that, can we maybe get a bit more deeper analysis, just so on Turkish electorate? This was kind of interesting to all of us as well, seeing some nationalistic, votes increasing, just in numbers. And while I was saying that, yes, it is true that Erdogan took the lead in both, in his race against Kılıçdaroğlu, and also in the parliament, AKP received the highest votes, but also across the board, we also saw a decline in AK Party votes, just so, and also, Erdogan also, couldn't secure over 50%. So there were some different balances there as well. It's not that simple, just so please fire out your comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Defne. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. I'm pleased to be together with such great colleagues discussing these pivotal elections in Turkey. I think I should like to answer your question looking at how Erdogan did and how Kılıçdaroğlu did. So Erdogan had two problems going into this race. One, the state of the economy. Two, a unified opposition, both of which he's doing actually. His unorthodox policies kind of drove the economy to the ground. The lira lost 500% of its value since 2018, when the economy went into recession, first time under him. At the time, it was led by his son-in-law. And these problems have only been compounded by pandemic and supply chain related issues. The unified opposition is also his own doing, changing the constitution to an executive-style presidential system, told the opposition that from now on it's a two-way race. So opposition parties that usually hated each other more than they opposed Erdogan got together, and they stayed together because they know that in a presidential system requiring a two-way race, they can only defeat Erdogan if they're united. So what Erdogan did is kind of go after these two issues. The economy, I think, macroeconomic indicators have not recovered. Turkey still has high inflation. Looks like public banks are sitting on a lot of bad loans and also other problems. But I think what Erdogan did is using resets with wealthy Gulf monarchies and starting huge financial flows from those places, including maybe $5 billion or more that the Saudis put into Turkish economy with no strings attached. And also encouraging investment flows and trade and tourism with Russia while supporting Ukraine militarily in the war. And at the same time, courting Putin. Putin also sent in a large lump sum payment last year. The amount is not clear, could be anywhere from 5 billion to billions in double digits. I think all these monies Erdogan trickled across, and Erdogan embraced a policy of really generous handouts of social security benefits, loan forgiveness, cheap credit, and wage increases. 45% of Turkey's workforce is paid minimum wage. Erdogan increased minimum wage multiple times in the last year. That amount has more than doubled. So I think perhaps there's a linkage here between support by fellow autocrats from Putin to MBS to MBZ, all of whom would like to see Erdogan win, in my view, especially Putin. He sees Erdogan as a like-minded leader with whom he can challenge the US-led liberal international order. That helped Erdogan. Economic problems did not go away, but the public felt a sense of relief, especially if you're on minimum wage and your income has increased by nearly 100%. Loans were forgiven and all of that. That's the problem number one, partly addressed, not fixed. Economy is still not in good shape, but a sense of relief thanks to large inflows coming from the Gulf and Russia. Unified opposition was a more difficult challenge for Erdogan. It meant that he had to really kind of go back to his polarizing tactics. And in this regard, I think Erdogan's greatest advantage, more so than let's say UAE or other financial inflows coming in, more so than anything else, his greatest advantage was his complete control of information flow. 90% of Turkey's media is owned by pro-Erdogan businesses. 80% of Turkey's citizens cannot read languages other than Turkish, so he can curate reality for them. And the reality in the run-up to elections was not a massive earthquake in which thousands died, sadly and unfortunately, and after which many waited under the rubble in freezing temperatures by government aid agencies. Those agencies were not there because Erdogan had gutted them out. There was no discussion of that. There was also no discussion of hyperinflation, journalists and politicians in jail, but rather a debate that Erdogan had made, a narrative that Erdogan had made Turkey a great military industrial power. If you watch Turkey from outside, you say, well, that's only part of the picture. Yes, Turkey has huge military successes in the last few years, drones, it has won wars against Russia in South Caucasus and Libya, Wagner's army, Chinese drones. Those are very impressive accomplishments, but that's only part of the story. The rest should include earthquake, lackluster government response to it, democratic transgressions, lack of freedoms, including many citizens' inability to access basic freedoms such as assembly, association, and media. That narrative was not there, and for 80% of Turkey's citizens who read and follow the news through the government-aligned media, it was basically about Turkey becoming a large military industrial power. It also worked because I think Erdogan's information control helped him divide the opposition. Alper mentioned this in his reference to Kılıçdaroğlu's Alevi identity. So I did some research, very preliminary. I like to look at maps as a hobby, and I'm going to develop this further after the runoff, perhaps with more precise results. It looks like Kılıçdaroğlu's alliance, where he brought right and left together to challenge Erdogan, worked in large cities and in Turkey's globalized coastlines. In these areas, support for him equals the tally of votes for his party, CHP, and the right-wing parties in his coalition, and even surpasses it. So suggests that there was also momentum behind this alliance in big cities, which he won, and globalized coastlines and Thrace that he won.
So on the economy, Soner, maybe I can again start from you, and then the same round, we can. You are right, just so this is it's very insightful comments on that part, and there will be municipality elections in 10 months in Turkey as well. So given that, what do you expect, just Erdogan, if he also takes, just wins on 28th of May in the runoff, to continue with the current programming, and whether he will stick to, again, the nationalist policies in international relations? What will be his voice there?
Someone kept just asking me this question, fascinating. I think this is what everybody's looking at. It's almost like we're assuming that Erdogan is going to win this runoff, and then the question is, what does Turkey look like at that point? So the issue is whether Erdogan will return to economic orthodoxy or will double down with unorthodoxy. Even if he does return, pivot back to orthodoxy, markets analysts are saying that the gaps are so huge, this black hole in the economy, that it's not just going to be a kind of a reset back to orthodoxy. The lira has been kept, its value has been kept artificially high by the Treasury, central bank selling foreign currency exchange, of course, foreign exchange reserves rather. So it's not that as if I think a return to orthodoxy is going to be a walk in a rose garden. He could eventually do it, but Erdogan's instincts, I think, prove to him that maybe this is sustainable given his deep and budding relationship with Putin and MBS and MBZ. So maybe Turkey's model continues to be kind of courting investment flows and financial transfers from these economies. If a return to economic orthodoxy is going to create problems, he has local elections coming up. So eventually, I think a return to orthodoxy will bring Turkey back to speed, but that may take much more time than the spring elections nationally, which are for local government. So my prediction is Erdogan stays kind of where he is and doesn't necessarily return to orthodoxy right away. And his foreign policy, therefore, remains transactionalist, relying on Putin greatly and developing further ties with Gulf monarchies. And so kind of pitting everyone against each other to get Turkey what he wants. Opposition, I think, will also kind of stay, at least for the time being, united, because they know even if this is not an outright win, they'll know that there's no way they can win Istanbul and Ankara, other big cities, if they're divided. So perhaps more of the same, at least for another year, until the local elections in spring. And then, of course, change could be in the offing.
Thank you, Soner. From you, I'd like to move to Ambassador Alper Coşkun. Alper, you used to serve as Turkey's ambassador, to, just Azerbaijan, and, and have been imports, and also Director General for Security at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just with your very experienced, in Turkish foreign policy. And so how how does it look? So if there will be in the second runoff, Erdogan becomes the president again, and with the AK Party majority, with the NATO question in hand, and U.S.-Turkey relations, the issues that everybody knows on the table regarding Syria and and also EastMed and the Turkey-Russia relationship. So where Turkey will land in this relationship, after the second runoff? And I will ask the same question if also Kılıçdaroğlu wins with the current parliament composition as well.
Thank you, Defne. Thank you for the kind words as well. Let me start with the economy. I totally agree with the picture that Soner depicted. The Turkish Central Bank has been doing backdoor interventions since December 2021, and recent figures that were floated in Bloomberg suggest that more than $177 billion were spent in that effort to prep up the Turkish lira, $30 billion in the month of April alone. So that basically shows you the severity of the challenge and the artificial nature in which the Turkish economy and the Turkish lira has been kept afloat. Erdogan will continue to do this until the presidential runoff, but then it's going to get difficult. So whoever wins the presidency obviously will inherit a very challenging situation. Erdogan has vowed to continue his unorthodox economic policies. He will probably feel vindicated. The society has not reacted negatively overall, given the electoral results, though there's a decrease in his figures, as Soner put out there. But overall, he's won the majority in parliament, and he is very close to clinching the presidential title as well. So he will feel vindicated. But there's a dichotomy there. The fact that he will feel vindicated and that this has not weighed on the electoral result to the extent that one would expect does not mean that the challenge is not there. On the contrary, he will inherit if he wins this challenge. And it's difficult to see how long he can sustain this policy simply with financial flows from the Gulf or from Russia, because even Gulf countries, and we see this in the dynamic between, for example, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, even the Gulf countries are a bit more scrutinizing in money lending, and they are looking for more orthodox economic policies in the recipients of these types of financial flows. Putin may be inclined not to be so scrutinizing in supporting Erdogan, but of course he himself is heading into his own challenges, given the implications of the sanctions and so on. So in the long term, I don't think this is sustainable, but I don't expect a short-term shift, particularly with the local elections looming. Erdogan will probably stay the course in this regard in the short term, despite all the challenges I outlined. I would say the same for foreign policy. And in fact, there, it's interesting, the results of the elections show that the Syrians in Turkey and the notion of uncontrolled migration are really weighing heavily on the minds of everyone. And it is a very combustive topic, one that Erdogan has not focused on as excessively as other splinter parties, or, for example, Sinan Ogan, who was the third contestant for the presidency. And that is an area where even Kılıçdaroğlu, he tweeted today, and he's made these statements today, will be increasingly inclined to focus on. So I think whoever wins on the 28th of May, we will see this element being more prominent in both rhetorical form and in terms of a priority in Turkey's foreign policy goals. And there, despite the economic circumstances, which would lead one to believe that both Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu would like to have stable relations with the West and not rock the boat, on the opposite side of that, on the flip side of that, I would suggest that because of domestic political considerations, both may be inclined to use and even weaponize. Erdogan has done this in the past. Kılıçdaroğlu will not do it to that extent, but he's inching closer to it. And when we look at his statements today, to weaponize the issue of migration in Turkey's relations with Europe. So I think we're entering a more complex phase in relations with Turkey. On NATO, in terms of Turkey's approach to the alliance, I think we can expect in both cases Turkey to continue its commitments to the alliance, to recognize, if not in a very outspoken manner, the importance and the deterrence that being a NATO member provides for Turkey overall in its security mix. That said, particularly as far as Erdogan is concerned, we'll see a very transactional approach. He will continue to try and play off Russia and Turkey's relations with the West against each other. Kılıçdaroğlu, up until yesterday, or up until the 14th of May, was quite outspoken in terms of ensuring that he would reorient Turkey to reflect its place in the Western security architecture, which would lead us to believe that he was talking about acting more in a like-minded manner in terms of Turkey's NATO membership or its engagement with its Western allies. But with these results and with the rise of the nationalist sentiments evidently visible in Turkey, and given the statements that he's already been starting to deploy going into the presidential runoff, it's quite clear that he will be increasingly inclined to revert to populist rhetoric. I don't think he can match Erdogan in that regard, but that shows you the general trajectory that one can expect from Turkey after the elections in either scenario.
Thank you, Alper. Before moving to Aslı, I'd like to apologize from all the audience that I'm very dark, may look very dark on the screen. It is because of the huge storm in Ankara. I'm in Ankara right now, just so, which was an unexpected storm. So apologies for that. Aslı, coming back to you on the same questions, maybe before the, touching base on economy, just so, and also, the international relations and NATO and so on, maybe I can ask also you the new electorate system that was put into place just recently, how that also played and affected the results according to you, just in these elections, which I think our international audience who may have joined now may not be aware of that, but I think it is also important to see how it played with the election results this time. Thank you.
So Daphne, let me quickly touch upon all the other issues you've raised and then maybe get to the new electoral law. On the economy, I do expect tough times and tougher times ahead, including a serious devaluation of the Turkish lira, perhaps not until the second round, the runoff elections, but soon afterwards. I'm also more inclined to agree with pessimists on the economy side who worry that Turkey could head to some type of a crash because of this dollar-denominating savings scheme, which the government has introduced in order to encourage people to keep their savings in Turkish lira, but it is enormously increasing the burden on Turkish treasury. So my colleagues have laid out the sort of the backdoor scheme that President Erdogan's government has been doing. I think there will need to be a continuation of that simply because they would need to keep pedaling. But I think that that makes Turkey more vulnerable on the financial front. And perhaps, it's also going to be in an intuitive way, one reason why Turkey next government, if it's an Erdogan government, Erdogan 2 government, let's say, would need to get along with Turkey's European and Western partners. I don't think this economy can handle a rupture with transatlantic partners. That is not to say Turkey will not be a challenging partner, as we've seen over the past few years. This is a country that believes in its place in the world as non-aligned. It's the non-aligned member of the transatlantic community. There is very much a sense, particularly within President Erdogan's more conservative base, a sense that Turkey is rising, that it's destined to be a regional hegemon, even a global power. And in fact, President Erdogan has called his campaign century of Turkey, that 21st century will be the century of Turkey, so on and so forth. All of these things push Turkey towards a more independent, non-aligned position when it comes to key geopolitical issues. We've seen Turkey's balancing act between Ukraine, the West and Russia in the war in Ukraine. We've seen Turkey trying to develop a sort of a tactical but still important economic relationship with China, with Africa. This is a country that sees we're already in a multipolar world, and that the fact that we are past U.S. supremacy in geopolitics is seen as something that opens up new possibilities for Turkey. So I think that trend will continue. If I could open a small parenthesis and announce that today, I think the Russians have agreed to extend the Black Sea grain deal in negotiations that Turkey was also, I think President Erdogan was also involved. This shows the sort of the complexity of Turkey as an ally, sometimes challenging, but at other times being able to deliver on issues that it wouldn't have been able to maybe if it was a sort of a solidly on the transatlantic side. I think that we also have a more nationalist Turkey today, decisively more nationalist Turkey today than we did a week ago, and it is too early to fully sort of think of the consequences of that. Except that it sort of it reinforces the trend for a non-aligned position. But one thing I can say is that it's not necessarily good news on the Kurdish issue. Those who expected maybe a sort of a thaw, a more of a seamless sort of let's say, maybe normalization in Syria that could also help Syrian Kurds and Syrian regime normalize. All of those scenarios look more difficult today, I think, than they did last week. And on your question on the new electoral law, this goes back to our early discussion on the early part. Were there allegations? Was the act of voting one of the key features of Turkish system that people had faith in? Was it skewed in one direction or another? Again, we don't know. What we do know is we don't know, and I think nobody knows. Although people seem extremely nervous, the main opposition party on the election night came out and said, "We're ahead. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is the next president of Turkey. Our numbers don't match with the numbers we're getting from the election board." But then they went radio silent, so leaving the entire country, particularly their voters, I think, in an irresponsible way to speculate if there is anything. There is something. I am in Istanbul now, not in Washington. The moment I go to one of the shops in my neighborhood, or I have coffee in a cafe in my neighborhood, people come up to me, knowing that I used to be a journalist. People come up to me and ask, what is happening? What is the negotiation? Are they ahead? Are we ahead? So these are this is not a good situation, in my view, strategically for the opposition. If it comes out that there were irregularities, but they weren't able to hold on to their vote, I think people will question their ability to hold on to their vote in the second round. But to get to your question about the new election law, the new election law has done away with has appointed the senior most judge in every town, city as the head of the election board, with parties being able to contribute members to that election. And the criticism at the time was that this would be the person that would volunteer for this would be a judge who's more leaning in the direction of the opposition. What the other feature of the law was, the other situation that mattered in this election was that Kurdish party, the pro-Kurdish party, which used to be called HDP, but was under threat of closure from the Constitutional Court. So they entered the elections under an entirely different banner, Yeşil Sol Party, the Green Left Party, but could not have monitors or could not have official members at the election boards in small towns, villages, constituencies, because they were not, they didn't have that, there was no time for them to get that right. The election board says you cannot have official. So that, according to them, created complications whereby their votes were registered, they say, under different party banners. We don't know, of course, we need more transparency from the political parties, opposition parties, but also from the election board. One thing I can say is that usually, even if we accept these issues to be, these irregularities to be favoring the government, President Erdogan, in my assessment as a journalist who used to cover politics before, they do not add up to a huge percentage number. In other words, I don't think they change the issue fundamentally. It may matter 1%. Or even more, slightly more, but it doesn't. These don't add up to a situation in which there's a 5% change in the system. But as I said, I'm saying all that with a lot of caution, because there needs to be more evidence in terms of, and more understanding in terms of what happened. But geopolitically, what is interesting is, President Erdogan, who will come back maybe even with greater confidence, and he will feel he's re-elected with but sort of he's vindicated he doesn't have to face elections for the next 5 years, and he's very difficult to guess as a person and as a politician. People assume it means it's going to make him drive a tougher bargain. It's going to make him more intransigent in some of the international issues, but it could have the opposite effect. It could also make him more sort of, more relaxed about his own future, having done away with elections and having secured another win, and perhaps more willing to engage and compromise on issues like Sweden's ratification of Sweden's entry into NATO. I know there's a question. I just wanted to throw that in. I think that one way or another, I do hope Sweden's bid will be ratified. We just don't know if it will be in time for the Vilnius summit or not, but probably more intense negotiations over the next months until the Vilnius summit. Whoever wins is my guess.
Also, thank you. Just so I will pick up on that and ask quick questions, both Alper and Sona, regarding their expectations on Sweden ratification by Turkey, regardless of who will win. And regardless of who will win as well, how to fix the relationship with the Turkey-US issues. And from there, actually, this is one of the questions also by US Ambassador to Armenia, John Heffern. His question is that, is Erdogan's increasingly unhelpful approach to NATO and the West pure transactionalism and more ideologism and nationalistic? So I think the question is whether, just his approach will change or not, if I got it right. So from there, just so let's get the very quick answers also from Alper and Sona, and then I will move to our audience questions. Thank you.
Let me quickly step in. It's good to have a question from John Heffern. He and I sat next to each other at NATO for quite a while. It's very nice to see that he's joining us kindly. I want to pick up where Aslı left, because I think that's important. When we look at Erdogan and the way he conducts foreign policy, that's exactly the point, what Aslı mentioned. One can expect him to move in either direction. If he wins the elections, he will feel vindicated. I spoke about the landscape in which Turkey will find itself, which is increasingly leaning, it seems, to a more nationalist worldview, which may have implications on how Erdogan approaches. And it's sort of his visceral view of affairs anyway. But on the other hand, and this goes to John's question as to whether Erdogan's approach to NATO and the West is ideological or transactional, he's also a very pragmatic politician. We see this in the recalibration that Turkey has been undergoing in its foreign policy for the past 2 years now. Erdogan is ready to shake hands with Assad. He's already shaken hands with Sisi. The first one is someone he's vowed to overthrow, and Sisi, not a word has been left unspoken in derogatory terms about Sisi either. But now Erdogan is ready to mend fences with them. So he's transactional in that sense. And I don't think, despite the fact that deep down inside he has his ideological preferences, I don't think Erdogan is captivated in the idea that Turkey is a part of the West. He sees more Turkey somewhere in the middle, I believe. And society seems to be inclined to feel that way as well nowadays, which manifests itself in the desire to further Turkey's relations with Russia, potentially with countries like China. But that said, we've seen over and over again, when push comes to shove, Turkey's NATO membership and its presence in the Western security architecture is something that everyone who even advocates what I was just talking about as Turkey being more of a country that needs to follow an autonomous foreign policy, they all fall back on that position. And it's a reality. Turkey's military standing, the standards that it follows, have all been a result of its membership in the Western security architecture. Turkey now, of course, and for a long time, has been an important contributor to that. There's no doubt about that. But this goes two ways. Turkey has also been benefiting. And so I think what Erdogan will try and do is to strike a balance, probably. And the economic realities, Aslı alluded to that, she's absolutely right, will also push him in that direction as well. On Sweden, quickly, I think that either way, Turkey will be closer to ratifying both under Erdogan and under Kılıçdaroğlu, particularly given the fact that Sweden seems to be moving in the right direction as Ankara would expect them to be. So I am more optimistic in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Alper. Soner?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start with a kind of prediction for what happens in the runoff, because I think that will inform Erdogan's decisions at home and inform policy arena as well. Unless Erdogan magically endorses Kılıçdaroğlu, unlikely. If he endorsed anyone, I think it'll be Erdogan. And even if he endorsed Kılıçdaroğlu, Ogan, that is, not all his voters would follow him. We would still get a very competitive race, maybe a contested outcome, 50-50. But I think it looks to me that not only Erdogan now has already incumbency advantages, he also has a natural momentum behind him. You know, he looks like the winner. He won the parliament with a landslide. Actually, that's where the expectation was really off. There were analysts who were saying this is going to be really close, but very few people were saying Erdogan's bloc would take over the parliament, and even if it did, by a few seats. But this is a very comfortable majority, over 320 seats out of 600. What is more interesting is that the nationalist and right-wing representation in the parliament has increased broadly. Nearly 25% of CHP deputies, about 170 deputy cohort, are from right-wing parties that entered the parliament on CHP ticket. There's also Kılıçdaroğlu ally E party, Turkish nationalist. So the parliament is 2/3 right-wing for the first time in Turkey's recent history. And when I say recent, I think for quite a few decades. And I think that will have implications for foreign policy and domestic politics. Especially if Erdogan wins comfortably, he'll feel vindicated, and he'll use, of course, the parliament and pressures from it while being guided by it for, certain measures at home. I think that we'll see a doubling down on Jacobin social conservatism in government legislating. We have, minor partners to the government, Erdogan, but hard right-wing factions, one of which wants to, for example, segregate public education. Not going to happen, but there'll be cosmetic changes towards that end, and maybe incremental changes. And the foreign policy side, I think, despite even if a win is clear and comfortable and supported by a supermajority in the parliament, because of these right-wing factions, although they're not allied with Erdogan now, they can be poached eventually to the Erdogan side. Can give him, for instance, a constitution-changing majority. In Turkey, that's 360 seats. Would still require a referendum, but he can get there. I think that we're kind of going through another era of populism, in my view, in Turkey. Not less, but more. But that doesn't mean Turkey will not green light Sweden's NATO accession. I think it will. Erdogan's game plan is, and that's go to John Heffern's question, I think Erdogan is both. He, number one, really does not like US-led liberal international order and its values. In this regard, he's like Putin. But he's also a transactionalist because he knows that, for example, without NATO, Turkey is exposed to Russia, its historic nemesis. Notwithstanding the Erdogan-Putin bond, Turkey and Russia do not get along. They still fight or are in tenuous ceasefire agreements in various places, either directly or through their proxies in Syria, South Caucasus, and Libya. Ukraine is another one, of course, conflict where they're militarily on different sides. So I think Erdogan's game plan is to stay in NATO, maybe have an outreach to Biden. I'm sensing this because usually West bashing is a lead player in Erdogan's campaigns. This time it has the role of a supporting actor. So that suggests maybe after the elections, Erdogan will reach out to Biden for a reset as Turkey's unchallenged leader. And my sense is Turkey will veto Sweden's NATO accession, even if there is not a parliamentary ratification because of delays. Maybe Erdogan will basically say, I will do this. That will get him a meeting with Biden, probably at the Vilnius summit of the alliance, if not before. A lot of smiles and handshakes. And what that does is it allows, I think, Turkey to remain where Alper said it would be, really not joining either side between US and Russia, playing both sides according to its own interests, getting what it wants. But his heart, of course, I think Erdogan's heart, personally speaking, in my view, is not necessarily aligned with the transatlantic community. But the reality will dictate him to stay somewhere between US and Russia going forward.
Soner, thank you very much. Just from there, I'd like to, one of the questions from our audience is Serhat Çubukoglu, who is a friend and trans research and advisory group in Abu Dhabi. Serhat asks, just so whether, we should be expecting more military activism on sensitive issues like in Aegean or East Med or in Syria from Turkey, and given that increase in nationalist votes and Sinan Ogan's emergence in Turkish politics. Maybe whoever can take, including you and or Alper or Aslı, you all can reply, thank you.
Shall I come in here? I don't really expect huge activism in Eastern Mediterranean or Aegean issues, in part because President Erdogan, yes, Soner and Alper explained it beautifully. He does want to have this balancing act. He wants to have a foot in each camp without having to belong to it. But he does not have the Western leg of that equation working. He does not have enough leverage vis-a-vis the West, and basically the Biden administration, his relationship is very distant, and so what he will want to do is either reset or improve relations with the West, so he can play this balancing act better. Right now, Turkey is very vulnerable to Russia on so many levels, strategically and financially, and that's not really a balancing act. And I don't think it's something that Turkish leaders like, even with their anti-Western sentiments and disdain for a liberal order, etc. They still, I think, do not want to be as vulnerable as they are to Russia. And the way around that, the way to address that, is developing better ties with the West. And obviously the Aegean issue and Eastern Mediterranean issues, as a continuation of his normalization drive with Gulf countries, GCC, UAE, I think he would be more compromising, not compromising, but more open to dialogue, engagement, and not really assertive. But there are pockets where I would think that there could be a more assertive Turkish foreign policy. One is South Caucasus, in part because of the nationalist drive that we've seen, but also because there seems to be this sort of meeting of minds between Aliyev and Erdogan in terms of essentially isolating Armenia, and there were high hopes about a normalization between Turkey and Armenia, and it hasn't happened. And I think, given that we have tensions in South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that's one space I'm watching as a difficult area. And of course, Syria will be an interesting space to watch, both in terms of its impact on the Turkish-US relations and also steps towards normalization with the Syrian regime that we're seeing now from Arab countries in the region, from Turkish government. It has come out and said they'd like to normalize relations with Syria under a good deal of pressure from Russia. So there too, I think Western leverage and outreach to Erdogan will be interesting and might change things somewhat.
Also, thank you. I'm looking at the questions. I think we covered most of them, even though, but there are two questions that I would like to ask from the audience, two more. One of them, let's continue with international relations from Dagmar Koska, he's from EU delegation in the US. What are the areas for a most productive cooperation between Turkey and the EU in light of the results of the election, and how can this outcome be turned into an opportunity for our relations? So, who wants to take this one? Soner, Alper, Aslı, So please jump in. Thank you.
I can take a quick jump at that. But if you don't mind, just on the Aegean issue, I don't think picking a fight with Greece will be a priority for Erdogan. There's been a lull in rhetoric on both sides. Greece is going to elections as well. I think his priority, anyone's priority in Turkey, will be the Syrians in Turkey and fighting the PKK and the challenge that Turkey faces with the US in that regard. So I think that's where the attention will be dedicated. And that would also be in line with the need, to the extent possible, to not rock the boat with the West and with the European Union. Coming to that specific question, there are a couple of low-hanging fruits. The visa liberalization issue is potentially a low-hanging fruit, absent political challenges on the EU side, and assuming that Turkey would be able to fulfill some of the criteria that is still outstanding. Now, in this composition of parliament and in the rising nationalist tendency that we see in Turkey, I think it may have become more difficult to assume that Turkey would be able to resolve the counterterrorism legislation that needs to be done in terms of meeting the benchmarks. So that may no longer be a low-hanging fruit, unfortunately, whereas I used to think that it was. Another one that I think is, again, absent political challenges, particularly on the EU side, is the customs union modernization. Now there you actually have, objectively speaking, a win-win scenario for Turkey and the European Union. And even on the political objection side on the EU, if we assume, for example, if Greece might be one of those countries, objective analyses have proven that it actually benefits Greece as well, should there be a modernization of the customs union. So that might be an area where Turkey and the European Union, post-elections, irrespective of who wins, could find room to keep and regain momentum in the relationship, because Turkey, unfortunately, is clearly out of the picture when we're talking about the future of Europe and enlargement issue.
Thank you, Alper.
Come in, maybe.
Yeah, sure, Soner, go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, I agree. I think on the EU front, regardless of who the winner is, I think Turkey was going to reach out, in my view, to deepen and modernize customs union, because EU remains Turkey's largest trading partner, notwithstanding Erdogan's efforts, partially successful in the last decade, to change Turkey's identity at home from a secular to an Islamic society, partially successful again, internationally from a European to a Middle Eastern one, again, partially successful. There's a fact, Turkey's economy is completely integrated with the European Union because of customs union in place since 1995. And I think whoever the winner was, they would want to deepen that union, to add services and modernize it. And that will, of course, help Turkey's economy. So yeah, in a way, while Turkey plays Russia and US, I think it will also engage the EU economically. It's been interesting to see this new rhetoric against Syrian refugees being embraced now by Kılıçdaroğlu, opposition candidate. And if Oğan ends up either throwing his support behind Erdogan informally, likely, or even if he does not, he's not going to disappear. I think that he now represents a strain of politics. He will turn into, if he doesn't squander it, he'll turn into a force to be reckoned with, even if not in the parliament. I think that this will be an interesting issue in Turkish EU dynamics going forward. Turkey will not want to play a refugee camp for Europe, as the deal in 2015 had kind of put it into, under a new government. And while Erdogan will not want to necessarily muddy the waters with the EU, I think that the public pressures are now released. You have a significant kingmaker politician who's campaigned only on this issue, nothing else. His only platform, Oğan's platform, was, "I'll send the Syrians back," and he got millions of votes. And that was with little media access, no basically party framework to support him, just one message. On the East Med issues, I agree with Aslı. I think we'll see a continued de-escalation. Greek-Turkish ties will remain largely on a positive trajectory. Syria will be fascinating to watch, because Putin was, I think, wanting Erdogan and Assad to shake hands, but Assad was delaying that handshake. Assad wanted to give the gift of normalization, not to Erdogan, but to Kılıçdaroğlu. But now that Erdogan, if he's winning, of course, I think we could see normalization. That would include Turkey promising to withdraw from Syria, but Turkey cannot withdraw from all of Syria, because then some of these elements in Syria, Turkish proxies, will turn against Ankara. And Assad will promise to take all refugees back, but he won't take all of them back because he doesn't want the refugees. He's used the war in Syria for ethnic engineering, and most of the refugees are Syrian Arabs, Arab Sunni Muslims. He doesn't want them, of course, back. So I guess the handshake kind of between Turkey and Syria maybe is delayed, even if there's a nominal one. Maybe it's more like a nod than a handshake going forward.
Soner, thank you so much. Just so with that, just I'd like to turn our guest for one last sentence comment, just before the second runoff. And so what do you expect from now until 28th of May, just in rhetoric, the change in rhetoric of both candidates from the previous rhetorics and arguments that they have used against each other? Just so I also expect that this can still be a close call despite everything. And I think they both should and will be adopting new strategies. So what is your expectation?
How should we go? Do you want me to go first, or?
So you want to drop out, you need to drop out first. Maybe shall we start with you?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have pushed my other appointment, but
Thank you.
so I think, look, there's different ways of reading this vote. Glass half full, half empty, depending on what you wanted to see. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that Turkish society is very resilient and consistent in its demand for change, rule of law, and those issues. Yes, it's a more nationalist parliament. Yes, this is a very polarized country, like United States, like Brazil. But I think that it's more perhaps illiberal than a lot more illiberal than those countries. But I think the fact that 45% came around and said, we'd like to support a campaign whose first pledge is democracy, I think is important. President Erdogan offers a lot, both in terms of future vision, nationalism, but also his track record in the past. So, but identity issues have also shaped this campaign. He has been able to trigger a red wave, a conservative wave, facing a challenger who came from a minority background and wasn't the most energetic campaigner. So this doesn't mean Turkey will forever remain in its current trajectory. I think there will be other elections and desire for change in the country. President Erdogan will have to manage that and have to rule with the understanding of that. I'm not entirely pessimistic for the long run. What I do think, though, this was almost one of Turkey's last chance to go back fully to pivot back to transatlantic community. Now I think the idea of a Turkey that is non-aligned, that is charting its own course, with a foot in each camp, is here to stay. And, there may be a change of government at some point in the future, not likely in the runoff, but at some point in the future, of course, there'll be other governments. But I think there too, Turkish exceptionalism, the idea that this is a country that is going to be a regional power in a multipolar world, will be the primary future. That doesn't mean Turkey is not an important ally. That doesn't mean Turkey is not part of the, West. It's not part of the West, but it shouldn't work with the West. I think on issues like war in Ukraine, trade issues that Alper talked about, particularly at a time when we talk about decoupling or divesting, de-risking from China. Turkey is an important country on the edge of Europe, and also important country to as a regional regional power in terms of its influence in both the Middle East and the Balkans. So it's going to have to be, we're going to have to live with the Turkey that we find, not the Turkey that we'd like to see. I am also trying to come to terms with that, but there still are very many reasons to keep this engagement and dialogue and partnership going forward.
Thank you, Aslı. Alper?
Yes, just a couple of points to wrap up. First of all, Erdogan is clearly closer to victory. It's clear in my view. That said, he's in decline. His vote base has decreased. And Aslı's right, the resilience of Turkish society was on display here. The fact that Erdogan has exceeded expectations and that a conservative majority seems to have gained control of the Turkish parliament is not really fully reflective of other dimensions of society. For example, one of the aspects that Erdogan has been complaining about was his inability in 20 plus years of rule to really connect to the Turkish youth and to engineer the mindset of the Turkish youth. He's been complaining that they have not been able to do that. And that's evident in the low degree of support for AKP circles among the youth. That said, Ogan, for example, seems to have tapped into that. And there we see more nationalist, secularist tendencies. So there are really a lot of complex dynamics in Turkish society, which will continue to be the case. And I think one of the important prisms to retain while looking at Turkey from abroad, particularly for Turkey's allies and partners in the West, is to try and see Turkey beyond both the lens of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the lens of this particular election, because irrespective of the outcome of this election, and irrespective of the impact of another 5 years under President Erdogan may have, I totally agree with us. At the end of the day, neither Europe is going away, nor is Turkey going away, nor is that relationship going away with Turkey's partners in the West. The nature of it may be shifting, but that's the reality and fact of life. One last point, I think a rising star that I also links into what I said from this whole process, actually dating further back from the Istanbul elections, is Ekrem İmamoğlu. He and his ability to reach out to different segments of Turkish society, including the more pious and conservative segments, his ability to reach out to the youth, his leadership skills, his oratory skills tell me that the real rising star in Turkish politics is actually coming from the CHP in the form of Ekrem İmamoğlu. I don't see a commensurate rising star on the part of the AKP. Ogan has fared successfully, but we have to see. The proof of that pudding will only be obvious in time. So I think that is another dimension to bear in mind. And with local elections coming up, there's a lot at play.
Excellent point, Alper. Just on that, and thank you for underlying this. This is important. And Soner?
Sure. Let me pick up Alper's point. I also think that Ekrem İmamoğlu is probably the opposition's candidate for presidential race in the next elections, whenever they are in Turkey. He's definitely a rising star, but I think in the short term, the outlook for May 28th. So started saying that Kılıçdaroğlu's underperformance compared to the polls that had set up expectations high was because his right-left alliance worked well in big cities and Turkey's globalized coastlines, but not so well in the middle Turkey, the inner Aegean, central Anatolia, the northeast, and the Black Sea coast, where right-wing voters in his alliance did not vote for him, either because they took Erdogan's message that he is an Alevi and therefore an insufficient Muslim, or that his alliance is quote-unquote backed by terrorists. All these things are in quotes, of course. It's now up to him to reverse these, get rid of these labels rather. And it will be hard given that he has zero access to media, almost completely controlled by Erdogan. I think that the challenge is really multiple. So if he doubles down on the HDP support, it's not 100% forthcoming. I started saying that it looks like turnout in Kurdish majority provinces dipped while it was increasing in the rest of the country. Turnout was 88, an historic high. It reached 90, 91% in Izmir and Edirne. That's phenomenal. But turnout dipped, unlike the rest of the country where it all increased across in Kurdish majority provinces down to 80% in Hakkari and Van. Part of that, I think, is also, I guess, among conservative Orthodox Shafi Kurds, not wanting to vote for an Alevi candidate. So there's no perfect way for him to get this. If he goes for the Kurdish vote, he'll alienate more Turkish nationalist votes. And even then, it's not guaranteed that the HDP will completely back him, the base. And if he goes for the other side, of course, losing HDP vote is not the way forward. So hard for him. So I see three outcomes on May 28th. Let me start with them. One is a close win for President Erdogan, contested by the opposition. He wins by 51% or so. It's likely. Erdogan, I think, feels going forward kind of precarious in his position, like despite his incumbency advantages and complete control of institutions and media, he only got 51%, not as comfortable. And he's going to keep his eye on the local elections. It's a national vote. It's for local government, but sort of acts like a midterm in the Turkish context compared to US elections, a reality check. So he's going to keep his eyes on that, and that means also various economic and foreign policy initiatives. The next outcome is kind of the least exciting of the three as an analyst, where Erdogan wins by a few points. Of course he would. He controls institutions and media. What do you expect? The last outcome is kind of another interesting one, analytically speaking. He wins by a landslide, maybe more than 5% margin, close to double digits, possible. A lot of the Kılıçdaroğlu voters might be so disappointed that, by the outcome where he trailed Erdogan by 4 points behind, may not go to the polls. That will, both depress support for him, and also in terms of election security. Observers who have to stay at the ballot box till the count, and sometimes count takes hours, it goes into the next day. All of these could result in a landslide. That's a very different Erdogan. It's an Erdogan who feels vindicated on his unorthodox policies, on his foreign policy, who doesn't have to worry about public pressures anymore. So I think a lot really depends, in my view, on the outcome, and I'll be watching that together with my colleagues here.
Thank you, Soner. Before we wrap up and end the session, just looking at if there's any last more points from Alper or Aslı, but if not, I would like to thank both Aslı, Alper, and Soner for this very powerful panel. I think we elaborated a lot of things, and also I'd like to thank all our audience who joined today and stayed with us more than an hour right now. And we will have also another session right after the second runoff on 28th, on the 31st of May, which we will announce. And so I'm really hoping to see all of you there again, to follow. This is certainly a most interesting and election of the year, and also most important maybe for the globe as well, for many reasons. So we will continue to follow and analyze very, just closely. And thanks again for all joining us today. And again, thanks Alper, Aslı, and Soner for being with us with Atlantic Council today. Thank you so much.